So, let me set the stage for you at the start of how Titans Battalion came to be. I was 14 ish. Uh, I think. May have been 13. 13, 14, 15, somewhere in that range. Pretty sure I was 14. And it was either the summer before or after freshman year of high school. And I was brainstorming how to make shogi and chess able to face each other because I thought it would be interesting and I just wanted to. And I was experimenting with like just using a 9 by 9 board and taking squares out or um, adding an extra pawn row to the chess army and just moving everything to the side and just having an empty space or something. You know, ideas like that. And eventually, I got to thinking about another game that I played at the time called Four Way Chess. And I owned a few sets and I played with my friends. And I enjoyed it. And I realized it's kind of just attaching the chess army to the side of a central square. So, in that moment, that epiphany, I instantly realized that I had figured out how to make shogi and chess able to face each other. Just attach both of them to the side of a bigger board that could handle both of their widths. And the second thing that I instantly realized was that other games could adapt in this way and work in this way. Not just shogi, not just chess. I literally could attach any chess variant I wanted to the army to the side of the board, and we would be able to see how it went. A few of them would be like guaranteed to win, some would be guaranteed to lose, but I was most interested in the ones that had like a competitive possibility where the two armies were relatively close. So, that brings us in front of us. On that same day where I had that epiphany, I immediately begged my father to give me something nice to write shit down in, like a notebook. He gave me his old leather bound journal that he had never used. It was blue, and I immediately wrote everything down on the outside of it. And I'd already kind of begun using this for a different game design project on something I was calling Titans Battalion, just because it was a cool name. Where I was making this like war game thing where each of me and my friends would have an army and be doing this like campaign in some world against each other. And we would be keeping track of like what units died and what equipment we had and what food supplies we had. And it was grid based, originally designed for like a 64 by 64 grid with chess piece inspired units. And those ideas congealed together and I just wrote down, like, I looked up a list of the most popular, common, well-known chess variants, and I just started learning. I learned all of these games, like 10 of them in the same day, and I made a Go army, I made a checkers army, I made a Shang-Chi army, I made a shogi army, of course, because that was the initial idea, a Jesson Moore army, checkers Go, and at that point I realized that some of these needed a little help in balancing because maharajah and the sepoys, for example, was a solved game, and it was solved in favor after reading the Wikipedia article and learning the game of the chess army. And there are other versions of maharajah and the sepoys, for example, that just use like a rook, a bishop to one, an alfil, and a knight movement and a bunch of other like different variations, but all of them seem to be just solved for the chess army. And that meant that even if we did mess with it, like maybe we randomized the starting position or something, and like no matter what, we would end up with this really one sided battle if I included this. But that didn't deter me. So I sat down with my buddy Liam, and we were like, okay, what if we give them a normal king and then also have the Amazon? All right, it's still completely losing for that side. Okay, what about two Amazons? Okay, it's still completely losing. More competitive, but completely losing for that side. What about 3 Amazons? Oh, no, no. 3 was too many. 3 was too many. We tested it. It went terribly. They won every time. So that was the threshold. And we learned in the course of like a few days of testing that 1 Amazon was too few. 1 Amazon and a king was too few. 2 Amazons too few. And 3 Amazons was too many. So what else do you give them? And keep in mind also that at this stage in us balancing things, I just buffed everything. I wanted all of the armies to be powerful and really capable defensively and offensively because, I was young and bad at doing this at the time. These days, armies are much more true to their base game. And we called the initial naming and scheming of the army Triplet Sons, and then Twin Sons once we went back down to 2. And Twin Sons at the time didn't have the lore it does now. It's actually one of the best written lore armies. I have like a whole story planned for this. It's really like I could write a short story just on the lore of Twin Sons, and I think it would turn out really well. I intend to just make it into one of the RPGs. All right. So I've probably been rambling for a bit now. How long? 7 minutes. And I haven't talked about the army at all. So Liam and he actually had an idea of a mechanic where, since they were called suns, what if you orbited other pieces around them? And as usual, Liam throws out a crazy idea that doesn't necessarily make sense, and my brain, without me even trying, makes mechanics for it. So what we ended up with was what's called rotation, or orbiting. And these pieces, which would be the suns, these are the 2 suns, which were initially Amazons. You'll notice they're different points. They're meant to be defined differently. This isn't our final art for them. I'll show you that later. But these guys are the center of the orbits, and the king can also do it. And these pieces are what would be the planets. We called them flares at the time. And the way orbiting works is, let me just throw these guys into, yeah, here works. So you take the position relative to this, and any rotationally equivalent square is a place this could move to via orbiting. So there, 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 and there are all valid. And the same goes for this one, around this one. Here, here, or here. Now, this is a non-capturing movement, and it has always been a non-capturing movement. We brainstormed very briefly about letting it capture, but it's obvious why we didn't do that. And that also means that this, around this one, could go here. It would be able to go here if it wasn't off the board. And for these guys, same idea. These are all the rotationally equivalent squares for this. One easy way to quickly visualize it is if you draw queen lines out from any of these centers, right? Then you can reflect the current position across these spots and be able to instantly see all of the squares that they would be able to orbit to. And that's a really easy way to visualize it for people getting fast at reading. For the record, I'm pretty sure I'm one of the best at reading these quickly, just from time and experience. I believe the other ones, yeah, because here and here are off the board. No, not there. There. Mm-hmm. And this one is also not. So, as you can see, this can be fairly limited, but it allows for really fast movement, and it requires. That was the main thing that we really liked about it. Despite the fact that the definition of the rule is simple, it creates a situation where those that are best able to do geometric um, reflections and rotations in their head have an advantage. And being able to encourage that particular very useful mental skill, especially if we're teaching these games to someone young, is nice, as well as just helping train people that are older in that. So despite how complicated the individual rule was, we kept it. And because of the strength of the chess army at the time, mostly buffs to pawns, we were able to actually throw in 2 Amazons, a king in this position. In fact, let me just... And also the fact that we were very much weaker players than we are now. The army was initially laid out, and I'm showing you this because unlike other armies, it's not going to take me too long. This was the simplest army we had in the game for a long time. It had 5 flares, 2 suns, which were the Amazons, and the king. And these pieces could rotate or orbit around these pieces. And the flares could actually move as both an Alibaba and a knight, or just jumping to any square that was 2 away. And that's a really strong piece, by the way. Now we know it's worth 7. But at the time, the battlefield was 18 by 18. So the fact that this was a shorter range piece made it worth roughly equivalent to the rook on that larger board, especially considering how much stronger the pawns were in defending. Like, even this square, like somehow getting a piece back here, doesn't threaten the king with the buffed pawns we had, because they could move in all directions, not just towards the opponent, right? So that's a bit of normal Titans Battalion history and where this army started. And this army stayed exactly like this, unchanged, for about 5 years. And this unchanged army actually felt pretty damn balanced, just with what it was. We had a bunch of different strategies, interesting patterns for how to traverse safely across the board, called flare stacking and flare staggering. They were popular options because your defenses with this army were really low, because you had all these holes and ways for the opponents to get to you. The territory looked a little different early on. But eventually I joined the military, and we started approaching the modern era. The boards got smaller. The chess army became more like the chess army. Frost Beast was discovered to be absolutely busted in its old form. And really, the armies that defined old Titans Battalion the most, being Frost Beast, this one, Chess, to an extent, Reaper, from Chess 2 the sequel we were using at the time, 2 Kings, like those 2 Chess 2 the sequel armies were very popular among our, at the time, player base. Great Pyramid, and of course the Shogi and Shang-Chi armies. Those were the main ones. And Twin Suns ended up being my main at the time, because I was really good at visualizing all of the orbits. Like, just looking at this, I could visualize where all of the other pieces were going to end up. For the record, orbit will never let your piece change color, so all of these were stuck on dark squares at the start. If you wanted access to light squares, you had to move these guys at least once, and then be able to orbit on light squares. But the modern era eventually pushed us to really rigorously balance testing this. The pawns had been weakened, and we found that this army, in its current form, is a mate in X puzzle. And it usually turned out that we could mate in between 7 and 9 with this army versus this army, depending on turn order and positioning. And that was a problem. And we also found that with the weakened pawns, it just didn't feel good anymore. It felt really problematic, but the orbit mechanic was cool. And by that time, I had actually wrote out the Twin Suns lore and knew that this was King Prometheus, a great pyromancer. His wife died due to werewolves, and he tried to capture the power of the sun itself in a ritual, and he failed, and his twin daughters stepped in and split the power between them that he was initially trying to gain, and became these flaming elemental beings. Cursed in some ways because they could no longer touch anything without burning it. But also given the actual power to defend their kingdom against the ridiculous werewolf outbreak that had been going on at the time. And due to the decimation of their kingdom, the king actually mostly staffed the army with fire elementals of his own conjuring rather than with their people, because the people of the nation were precious. So the king had a unique position where he was de facto the entire military force, despite his old age, and his daughters would end up being the lead generals. Now, that being said, let's actually look at the modern army, because what happened next was, in our game design, I sat down and thought, okay, what could King Prometheus make as fire elementals and fire type abilities that they could do? And that was just a big long list of well, in the meantime, let me show you some art of one of the suns. This is Aurora. This is Lilac. Might be around here. Yep, here it is. Almost at the top of the chat. So what we ended up looking through is, first of all, we were looking at different forms of maharajah and the sepoys, different versions of pieces inspired on that. So that was our core template, was to look at those types of things. Then to try to figure out the optimal split between flares, suns, and embers, and weaker flares, like splitting things up a bit. And then furthermore, if I can find it, I made a list of a bunch of mechanics like fireballs and being able to do like AoE and detonate pieces like bombs and resurrect things like a phoenix, and I made them all into like fire spells, right? I basically made a bunch of fire spells for King Prometheus and translated them into chess mechanics and play tested all of them to see if they made sense. And the one that did actually stick was the fireball one, actually, where he could pick up one of his elementals and throw it. And we only gave this ability to the Titan. And what that meant, at the time we made it Queen line, but we realized later it needed to be Rook line, was that meant we could effectively have this guy throwing barrages and spinning flares out and have these powerful pieces. And it turned into this army of really fast, interesting mechanics. And then we just fine-tuned it over time after we messed with those two things, the flame slinging and the orbits, and of course having that maharajah and the sepoy roots still at its center. So let's talk about the pieces. This army never ceases to make me smile. It's the only original, completely original army in the core rotation, unless you count Frost Beast, which is valid to do so. And despite the fact that it's not my main anymore, I have a soft spot for this army. And I very, very much like the type of gameplay it promotes because it's really fast. It also has some of the best opening names of any of the armies, like the machine gun system, where you just move the king here, move this here, move this here, move this here, and immediately just try to flame sling as much as possible down this one column until your opponent cannot take it anymore. It's called the machine gun system. And another trait of the machine gun system is eventually this moves and you move over and you just keep flame slinging as much as possible, just basically acting as, no matter what, in 2 moves I can flame sling again and I will kill something when I do. And that's the whole idea, is just trying to barrage forward and being hyper aggro. It doesn't quite work. Playing that aggressively in any chess variant only works if you were already winning at the start of the game, which you shouldn't be. But if you temper and you're patient with it and actually, develop your conflagrations and make a pawn structure and take center control and get your flares and your hearth to the proper squares and then start attacking, it works. And during that time, your opponent has counterplay and can limit your space and can set up their own structure and develop properly. So it just plays like a chess variant now. Do note, if this was a standalone chess variant instead of an army, it would be played on a 7x8 board in order for all of the spacing to work correctly. All right. The foundation of any army or variant is the pawns, and how the pawns move determines the gameplay and feel. So these guys are the embers. And the embers move 1 square diagonally forward and capture. That makes them Berolina pawns by default. They do have a different battlefield movement than the other Berolina pawns in our game, which is the Spartans hoplites. The Spartan hoplites have a battlefield movement that lets them sidestep. But these embers move diagonally backwards and capture there. The embers are also one of 2 pieces in the army that we allow to be flame slung, which means if they are orthogonally adjacent to the king can fire them like a rook. And when they do that, they become what we call a fireheart, which, let me find the piece that we use for fireheart. Yeah, usually we use this phoenix piece for the fireheart. Any piece that gets flame slung of the 2 that can be becomes a fireheart when it is. And a fireheart has the same movement as the ember, but it captures in all 4 directions. So not only does it move it forward, it promotes it. However, the ember has an actual promotion to either a hearth conflagration or a flare when it reaches the enemy back rank. And that means you have to weigh the pros and cons between flame slinging and getting immediate payoff and a small promotion, or letting it get across the board naturally and create a real promotion. That also means, unless you flame sling, the pieces are color locked, so you always will have 4 embers on light squares and 3 on dark squares, or vice versa if the positioning is different, which affects gameplay a little bit. It doesn't affect it too much, but it does matter. Okay. The conflagration is essentially just a stronger ember. It moves just like a fireheart or an ember on the battlefield, 1 square diagonally, but it captures up to 4 squares away orthogonally. That means even though it can be flame slung, if it's like here and this has happened and this is here, it doesn't need to be. So normally when you're capturing to here, you would just go to here. But if you want to capture in this square, let's say this is here for some reason, you only cover these four normally, but because the king is here, you can flame sling it all the way. And the conflagrations are one of the minors of the army. In fact, they are the second weakest piece in the army, I would say. But they end up feeling around the strength of like a reasonably but not super well placed knight sometimes. So I would say this piece is probably 2.5 pawns, but it's hard to say. Flame slinging also works orthogonally. So if the king is here, this is protecting this square, and this is protecting this square. And if this moves, this is protecting this and this square due to the flame slinging. The Amazon is actually a little strong, it turns out. Too strong for gameplay against a normal king. At least for it to feel good and not just always result in mating puzzles for one side when you're, quote, close to balanced. It can work. I will say it can work, but usually you need to do something else to up the defense of the king at the start of the game, or just give an Amazon to both sides so the two can counteract each other. I personally am not a fan, after having tested it, of having an Amazon at all. Which means despite the maharajah sepoys being a thing, this army no longer has a true Amazon. However, both of these pieces, the sons themselves, Aurora and Lilac, move like an Amazon. But they capture like only one of the components of an Amazon, either the queen or the knight. So Lilac moves like an Amazon and captures like a queen. So she is a queen with a non-capturing knight movement, making her more maneuverable and harder to trap. It does also make her the strongest individual piece in most cases in the game. The only one stronger being a frost dragon in hand against shoguns specifically. And because the frost dragon can end up in hand due to shogi drop rules, and that piece in hand is absolutely devastating. Is there any other piece in the core armies that is similar strength? No, definitely not. So she is worth at least 10 pawns. Often we end up putting her at almost 11. Keeping in mind that we are scaling pawns as their strength in chess, the piece that's actually the most resilient to its value changing based on the matchup is the rook. So setting the rook to 5 and then scaling everything else accordingly ends up being better for human calculations and brain stuff. That also brings us to Aurora, which is essentially a knight with a non-capturing queen movement. That makes it just barely stronger than the Empire's Eagle, which is, it moves like a queen and captures like a knight. But Aurora is also able to move like a knight, and of course she still has the orbits around her at the center. Now these pieces, you'll notice, look like knights, and that's because they move and capture just like knights. They're just able to be orbited, so this one can also go here and here and here at the start of the game due to orbiting around those pieces. And if Lilac forward steps on the first move, now it's able to go here, here, where the king is by orbiting around that, where the other one is by orbiting around the king, here, not there. And around this one, here, 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 and the other ones are off the board. So via orbits, if I remove all these arrows, this guy is able to access all of those squares I just put in a circle as an initial move. Meaning that despite the fact that it only has a knight movement by default, it's actually a really mobile piece. Orbits are amazing. And again, the last part of Maharaja and the sepoys being the core basis of us figuring all this out was the fact that we ended up keeping the alfil movement for the hearth. So no longer did it have the orthogonal, but it kept these. And that has been fantastic for us. This piece is about the same strength as a rook. And of course, the fact that it can orbit makes it very flexible and very useful. I quite enjoy this piece. And that's it. That's Twin Suns in the modern era. That's how it works. Editing Roland here. Forgot to say that flame slinging always moves the piece to the maximum distance possible, including with the capture. And this is what happens when you, rather than giving up on an idea when it is incomplete or unfeasible, choose to try to utilize it as an opportunity to create something new. And being willing to bounce original ideas into something. Now, it doesn't always work well, but this one has. And it is, design-wise, my favorite army in Titans Battalion. Thank you. I hope you have a wonderful night. Before I go, I almost forgot to do this. Special thanks to Discord user Gluttony Main for making this lovely web app that I presented all of this with today. You can find a link to the Discord and the rulebook down in the description below. The Discord is where we meet, hang out, and talk about all this. It has over 200 people in it. Feel free to stop by.